All right, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here today to talk about this subject. I know this is a kind of a subject when we talk about regulations that can make people's eyes glaze over. So hopefully we can make this a little bit more interesting today. And really there's three things that we're going to cover during the course of this presentation. The first thing is we're going to talk about the increase in regulations and how it's a kind of a growing problem that we need to continue to be aware of. At the same time, there's benefits to regulation and how it applies to the data and analytics space. So we'd like to talk a little bit about what those benefits are as well. And then finally, how you can leverage Jupyter as a hub to help you manage these regulations and ensure that everybody that's using Jupyter kind of complies with the things that you need to focus on and things like that as well. But before we get started, let's introduce ourselves first. And Raj, do you want to go ahead?
Hey, I'm Raj. I've been with Capital One about a year. My background is product management. I did a stint in consulting, but then mostly in tech other than that. My time at Capital One, lead a couple of different projects on the data side, but one of the ones that specifically here is lead the tools that we, from the product management side, the tools that we do within one division of Capital One and what tools people can use to do their analysis.
And my name is David Schaff, and I've been with Capital One for 10 years. I've primarily been focused on data throughout my career, regardless if it was been at Capital One or elsewhere, and then been in data analyst roles, business analyst roles, and in engineering roles as well. And currently, I lead up the engineering teams that focus on building these products that Raj just mentioned as well. So the reality is that regulations have skyrocketed, and they continue to increase. If you just go back a few decades and you look at 1970, the Code of Federal Regulations, which actually kind of contains all of the information about what regulations are out there, has increased from 400,000 regulations to 1.1 million as of 2016. And the reality is that during the course of that time, each year there's about 200 to 300 significant final rules. And these are basically defined as rules that have an impact on the economy of $100 million or more, or they have an impact on other regulatory agencies as well. And while these have not increased, these are the type of things that really get enterprise organizations and smaller organizations concerned because of the impact that they have on those organizations. In addition, you have the substantial financial costs that is related to these. The Mercatus Institute at George Mason University did a study a few years back and found that U.S. regulations cost about $4 trillion out of the U.S. GDP. So roughly about 25% of the $16.2 billion trillion total GDP. In addition to that, back in 2012, there was a study that was done that showed that there is roughly about $10,000 of cost per employee for a company, regardless of what size it is. And of course, it can vary a little bit, but you can see that this is a relatively standard number across all of these different areas. So with this in mind, if we manage regulations well, they can have some positive impacts. And that's one of the things that I really think we all need to kind of take a step back and think about. They're there for a reason, and there's a reason that regulations came into play in the first place. The first thing is it drives unassailable practices. That means that it ensures that everybody's kind of doing things in the right way and thinking about the public good as they work through and do the work that they're doing. The second thing is it levels the playing field. And the reality is that sometimes there's bad actors in the marketplace. The marketplace is driven by profit, it's driven by investors, and the unfortunate thing is sometimes that can lead people to make choices and decisions that they shouldn't have made in the first place. So this way, we can ensure that people are playing by the same rules. And that way, that if you have somebody that's actually a good company and that is doing things the right way, then they can also compete and not be at a competitive disadvantage. And then I'm going to hand it for Rod for the
finally, it also balances the market accountability. And the thing about regulation is, yes, on the one hand, you want to be regulated and to protect our consumers, to protect our end consumers. And in fact, like many banks, we actually draw our envelope on what it means to be regulated, even much broader than what the government requires. But that being said, regulation actually has a positive market impact as well. People trust us with their money, they trust us with our loans. Being well regulated and making that a critical part of our brand is actually a big reason why people actually trust and use Capital One. And we want to be very sensitive and very serious about that trust that people put in us. So not only is it a thing necessary to protect the public good, we actually also find that being well regulated gives us a competitive advantage. There have been, I'm not naming names, but there have been banks where there have been some issues with the regulations and with certain compliance issues, and it's actually benefited us because then customers are coming to us because trust is a huge part of why they even use our company.
So the reality is regulations also have very real implications in the analytics space. So first of all, data must always be right and securely managed. And there's quite a few regulations that are out there that govern this. If you think about GDPR from a European Union standpoint, or more locally, if you think of things like Sarbanes-Oxley, these even govern things such as data classification and how you can share data between different groups. And so that becomes an important factor of what you need to consider when you build out things like your data infrastructure, or you're sharing data between users at the company that you work at or the organization that you work at as well. The second thing is how you got the answer matters. And the reality is that if you're a highly regulated industry, then your regulators come in and they take a look at what you're doing every so often. And it's important that you are able to tell them the steps that you took and how you got to the actual decisions that you had in the first place. And so in order to do that, you have to think about how you can capture those things as folks that are using tools like Jupyter are doing the work that they're doing. Raj?
And finally, you want to be able to change and adapt very quickly. Not only are regulations themselves changing, you have government changing, you have things happen that scare the public, and regulations change itself. We also need to be able to adapt very quickly because the business we're in, all our competitors are adapting very quickly. So not only do we have to maintain the regulations to comply with the regulations, maintaining the regulations and being able to adapt very quickly is a critical part of being able to stay compliant and stay competitive.
So with that in mind, then there's some things that you need to consider. First of all, data governance becomes integral to analyst work. And I can tell you I've been in a lot of experiences in the past where actually collecting metadata, getting an understanding of what the data is incredibly difficult. And then actually just managing people sharing data between different organizations is also incredibly difficult. It's kind of the thing that people really don't want to do, but at the same time, it's really important that you actually do it. And the benefit is I think the way that you kind of sell this to folks that are using your tools in your organization is that it's actually beneficial to them as well. If you do it the right way and you ensure that it's as easy as possible for them to follow the rules that are there, then it also helps them have a better understanding of what data is there, how to use the data, what is the right data element, and things like that you need to be using. Otherwise, oftentimes that is relegated to tribal knowledge, and you kind of have to know the person that just happens to know the data, or find who that person is in order to be able to really understand what you're looking at.
How you get the answer also matters because you need to keep track of everything. It's especially in our industry, it's critical that you can't just say, well, I wrote some model, I don't know how it works, it's a black box, but that's great. I think some of those in financial might understand. It's a black box, that's great, and this just gets us increasing market share. It's because we want to make sure, as I said before, not only is it to meet the regulations, but also for our brand image. We want to make sure we are not disadvantaging a population. We want to make sure we're not doing something that disparages someone just because of we don't want to discriminate against, right? Now, an algorithm might do that by itself, might come up with some reason where it does something like that. That's why we take a lot of pains to actually make sure that, yes, we use a lot of machine learning models, but we're also very careful that we know how those things work so we know whether we are actually doing things in a good and just way given our population. Regulations and meeting these regulations help us make sure that we're meeting these standards.
And finally, analytic tools must be highly resilient and easy to change. And this is really the value of having an open source project and leveraging something like that, like Jupyter, because it gives you the capability to make changes in the way that you need to. At the previous talk, Brian Granger mentioned this as kind of one of the things that's positive about open source. It can also be a negative as well, because sometimes open source can move slowly. But you as an organization, if you have the resources behind it, you can make changes to Jupyter yourself, and potentially you can contribute those things back also. In addition to that, it's really important to think about things like continuous integration and continuous delivery, and ensure that you have pipelines set up, whether you're developing a product or working on something like Jupyter, or you're trying to do something around machine learning. That ensures that over time, that as you need to make changes and you need to iterate on what you're doing, you can quickly make those changes. I'll just take a pause for a second and tell a quick story. So several years back, I worked on the Federal Reserve stress test and what we needed to do from a Capital One standpoint. I led the effort for our home loans division in financial services to actually put that in place. And we were doing that. Initially, we kind of did some work, and to be very honest with you, we did what we could do to get it done. But then over time, what the challenge became is that we have more and more changes come from the Federal Reserve. and they'd ask us to implement things in a couple of months period. So we had to really think about how can we actually do this in the right and as quickly as possible. And then that comes into play, making sure that you have these type of things in place so that as your regulators ask you to make changes, or if they ask you to respond back to something that they're interested in knowing or finding or something like that, that you're able to do that quickly as well. All right, so why do these implications matter and how do they show up? So first of all, let's start with data governance becomes integral to analytics work. So first of all, I had mentioned earlier data sharing. And so depending on the size organization you're in, this may not be as critical, but if you're in a very large organization, oftentimes you have different legal entities within that organization. And you have to manage your sharing across those legal entities. And there's restrictions on what you can share between one legal entity and another. So it's very important to kind of keep that in mind. If you are not an organization that has multiple legal entities, this is still something that you have to consider and be concerned about as well. Because if you need to share with another third party or something like that also, you also need to be thinking about these things, particularly if you have personal information that you're dealing with somebody or something like that. Second is metadata. And metadata, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of one of those things that people really don't want to focus on. But the truth of the matter is that people leave organizations. You end up, if you're in a situation where you're fortunate enough to share out data sets to the public, things like that, this is absolutely crucial to give an understanding of how the data actually works. And it takes a lot of time, and it's not necessarily fun to sit there and do the definitions around metadata, but it can pay big dividends in the long run. So it's something you really need to make sure you focus on. And finally, quality. So the quality of the data that you have, the reality is that junk that comes in it produces junk that comes out. Garbage in is garbage out. And the fact of the matter is that you never know what's going to be coming in. Sometimes there's changes in downstream systems, or you're getting something off of the public internet and somebody does something to the data set that you're using or something along those lines. And so you really have to keep this in mind as something that you need to guard yourself against. So if you're part of an organization, particularly an enterprise or even a medium-sized company, it's really important that you have quality, data quality reporting in place. Not just that you're checking it as you go along, but once you put something out there, you've done your analysis, you found the insight, and now you're using it as something that you're doing on an operational basis. You have to make sure that you have this data quality checks in place on a regular basis. So your decision makers, your executives, whoever else needs to see it, has a really good understanding of how the data is today. Is it of the right quality? Are there problems there? Are there anomalies that you didn't expect? So,
keeping track of everything, again, it adds a lot of value. So definitely we need to keep track of everything so that we get audited. We have a tremendous number of internal audits. Even we have to satisfy certain external audits like the stress test that David mentioned. For all that, of course, you have to keep track of everything. But the thing to keep in mind is this is not actually, like many people consider this like a trade-off. Well, if you keep track of everything, it's going to be burdensome. But we're actually finding that by keeping track of everything, we're actually doing better on our market side as well. Our strategy team, our marketing team is actually finding that because they keep track of everything, they have a much better idea of how our various programs are going. They have a much better idea of how they can actually react to things. So being regulated is actually not so much you have to trade off regulation versus a better business results. We're finding that doing these things to be regulated actually also builds the case to have better business results also. It's not a either or. We're finding increasingly that there are many, many use cases where it's actually an and.
Yeah, and just one more thing I would add to this. I mean, you can track this type of stuff technically as well. So if you have a installation of Jupyter set up, for example, that is central to your organization, then you can log all of the things and the messages that are coming through the pipeline. And that way you have a way to actually go back and see what happens. And from a technical perspective, that also helps you resolve issues and troubleshoot things that were going on. I was in a presentation yesterday by Kyle Kelly from Netflix, and they were talking about building on top of protocols. And underneath Jupyter, there's all of these messages that are sent back and forth between ZeroMQ and Jupyter itself. So that's something to consider as well, just logging all of that activity and making sure that you have an understanding of what's going on, so that if you do need to go back and reconstruct something, or you need to go back and figure out what happened at a given time, you're able to actually do that.
Actually, on that note, I want to go off message a minute and actually talk about something else David's team is doing related to that that's really exciting. They're actually even looking at, because we're serving this as a service to everybody, they are looking at how people are using notebooks. So we actually sit down, we're able to look at how people use notebooks. We're able to say, oh, these are like actually things that we can do better in SQL. These are things we can do better in Python. And it improves the kind of classes we can even give to improve our own analytical community. So we're improving the analytical community's ability to analyze data by basically saying, here are things they can do better. Or sometimes we find, oh, these people are doing things in a really best practice way. Let's find a way to broadcast this and make it more best practice. And that's really a very exciting thing that actually I think we're doing, which actually improves the entire analytical community.
Yeah, and then going on to the last step here, I think really the key thing here is that it used to be that a lot of organizations I've worked for in the past have analytics was not something that was highly available, that was out there all the time. Like you basically had Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, it was available, and then things would go down, and hopefully we'd be able to use stuff over the weekend. If you lost something, then it would be gone forever. You'd be out of luck, and we really didn't keep that type of information. But the reality is, in today's world, particularly because of the second point that we pointed out there, then it's really important to ensure that you have an analytics infrastructure that's highly available, that you can always use, and that people can work when they want to and when they need to. And you never know when you're going to have a question come in from a regulator or something like that you need to answer quickly, or something that happens in the marketplace that you need to address quickly as well. It's also important to ensure you have no data loss. The worst thing that can happen to you is you did all this analytic work, you really didn't document what was going on, and then you have no way to actually reproduce that later on. So it's really important you have a way to back those things up on a regular basis and ensure that you're not going to lose any of the work that's been done. And finally, policy and market shifts. I mentioned continuous integration and continuous delivery earlier, and this kind of goes back to that same concept that you're making changes over time. As the Jupyter community is making changes over time, you should be able to very quickly bring those changes in-house and put those changes into practice as quickly as possible, so that you can keep up with these type of things. Or if you add things in and you do changes yourself, you should be able to do the same type of thing.
So, I mean, kind of a theme that we've been talking back through this whole thing is this envelope between agility and governance. And this chart, it was kind of inspired by something I found in a really good Harvard Business Review article. But the way to read it is the x-axis is agility. So if you're nearer to zero, you're less agile. It takes you a lot longer to make any change. Further out, you're more agile. The y-axis is governance. If you're at the bottom, you're less governed. If you're at the top, you're more governed. The way to think about this is roughly, a retail company is more likely on the bottom part of the axis. They can be far more agile. They don't need to be nearly so governed. I've worked at retail companies before, and in some cases, they almost have very mini CIO groups because they don't have the same kind of regulations on marketing data as maybe a bank does. A healthcare company would be actually way more, will sacrifice a lot of agility to ensure governance just because they have so many critical requirements around HIPAA and everything else. Banks are in a weird space where we actually have to be very much in the middle. Our competitive environment tends to be a little bit more aggressive than healthcare companies. We're not geographically bound, so we're always competing with everybody, and the pace is incredibly quick. That being said, it's everyone's money, so there are regulations we have to comply to, and not to sound like a broken record, but not only just because we want to satisfy the government, but satisfying the regulations is a critical part of our brand and how we actually generate trust in our customers. What we're finding is there are many, many things that we've found with building these tools where we can actually push this envelope. And I'll give you one very small example. We worked to kind of make it easy for people to understand all their data sources and everything else directly within JupyterLab. What this lets people do is, on the one hand, it improves agility because now people don't have to go to different places to look at their data sources. It also improves governance because the way we built it was in compliance with our data risk team. And so whenever people make any of their data management moves, they're doing it in a way that forces them to be compliant. And so they're more compliant, but they're also more agile. And tools can help push this envelope further.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something I said earlier, just to kind of reemphasize again, is this is something that I very much encourage you to really think about, because the fact is that the reason people groan when we talk about metadata or data governance or things like that is because it is challenging. But if you can make it easy, if you can make it easy for them to do it, then embedded in the tools that you have, then people will follow those rules because it's very easy for them to actually do the things that you're asking them to do. And so I think it's critically important anytime you bring things like data governance into play in your organization, or you're thinking about these type of things, it's absolutely critical for you to make sure it's as easy as possible. It just doesn't feel like a policy that was pushed down from on high, that is something that's actually easy for them to do and comply with, and then it benefits them as well. And if you can put it in those terms, then people will follow suit very quickly.
It's not always easy to do, but I would say when you're trying to do your product strategy to figure out how to deliver things to your end customers, exactly as David said, like really push yourself to try to see, don't think of it as an either or, don't think of it as, well, I either have to help them be regulated or I have to help them be agile and I have to have a fight between the two. Try to push yourself to see how there's a win-win, how there's actually by doing this, we can make them more agile and way more governed. And the way now you can offer products as a service, it's far easier to manage this. It's easier than ever. It's not easy to do it. It is not easy. You have to have a lot of conversations, and you have to have multiple customers. We have our analysts on one side. We have our data risk team as an entirely another customer that we're dealing with. But if you work with them together, I think you will find there are many opportunities to do this better, to do this even better, not just give a trade-off. You can push the envelope, and we think that's possible for everybody.
All right, so let's take a look at what we kind of think of as an analytical cycle. And this may vary between different organizations and the way that you might approach things, but really we see that there's 6 steps. The first step is ideate, and of course this is where you really figure out what the problem is you're trying to solve, what things you might go do to actually solve those problems and so on. The second is explore, and this is where you go out, you figure out what data is out there. What's available for me to use to actually go and solve this problem? Who do I need to go talk to? What kind of research do I need to do? In the analyze phase, then you actually, of course, take that information and, if you're a data scientist, you may actually work on not just uncovering insights, but actually go and building the model that you're going to use in the future. And if you're in the analytics space as a business analyst or a data analyst, then you might use this time simply to uncover insights, maybe using something Excel historically or something like that as well. Synthesize is where you actually take that information, those results, and combine and consolidate all those results together so that you can share it with others. And then action may be where you discuss this with a decision maker and try to figure out what next steps you're going to take. And finally, deploy is where you take that insight and in many circumstances actually operationalize it and productionize it so that it can be used in the real world. And sometimes this can be the most challenging thing because maybe there's a handoff there and you have to throw something over the fence from the analyst team to the IT team or something along those lines. And so it's really important for this process to kind of be cohesive together. So
yeah.
What about feedback? Like once you deploy, you want to take the feedback and try to incorporate it in.
Yeah, so I think if you kind of look at this cycle, then it is just that. It's a cycle. So just as you have a decision maker that may review the results that you have, and then you may iterate with them before you even get to the deployment phase. And once you get there, that's why I said it's really important for you to have continuous integration and continuous deployment in play, so that you can be really agile about how you actually address feedback that comes up and ensure that you get it actually inserted into to the process going forward.
Without going into deep detail, like to give a more concrete example, like we have one group of people that are more on the ideate and explore phase. They're more on, and maybe analyze, they're a little bit more on the define the intent, like how do we set our policies to give the right kind of terms or whatever, right? And then we have different teams that are far better at saying, okay, now that you've defined the intent, let me figure out how to deploy it. And so it's part of the system, part of a model, so on and so forth. But it's not like these things happen one after another in a sequence. While a team is working on deploying the next model, the analyst team is already definitely working on figuring out what the next set of market tests are, what the next set of things to deploy are.
Yeah, Raj, can you back up just a couple of slides real quick? So, kind of as I was talking through this, then really there are regulatory impacts at different steps in this process. So the first thing is, in the explore phase, data sharing is often limited. And it's really difficult to even understand what data is available in the first place. You go on to the next one, then you'll see that, how did you get that answer? That's kind of the thing that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And then the next one.
In this one, I'll talk, one thing we're finding here that's interesting, right? In the old world, you want to look at how a decision was made 2 years back. You may have a PowerPoint and then you don't really know where the analysis of this PowerPoint was. Maybe you'll have an Excel table, maybe you'll have a pivot table and you don't know how the person came to that pivot table. The way we're doing it now, and we'll talk about this in a second, it's a lot easier to actually say, oh, this was the analysis, we have an actual document that's been written, and now we can rerun the analysis with modern data, and we know exactly how someone got the answer, and they can build off this answer for their next set of analysis.
Right, and then finally is just agility as regulations and market changes, and this kind of goes back to the question we just had about feedback mechanisms and things like that, and being able to move quickly. So, really, Jupyter can be at the center of this of all of this. You think of this entire cycle. It's possible to kind of encapsulate everything that goes on here within your Jupyter environment, and then maybe with some additional tooling like things like NBDime, for example, that lets you take your Jupyter notebooks and then merge them in with changes that you see on GitHub. Or you might use something like Jenkins or Travis CI for your actual continuous integration and delivery pipeline as well. So here's an example of knowledge repo, and this is something that Airbnb built. This kind of addresses a couple of different things. You see ideate and explore, synthesize and action are all highlighted. In the ideate and explore phase, what knowledge repo allows you to do is take notebooks that others have produced and put it into one central repository for people to share. Now, I'm not talking about storing it like in a GitHub sense in a central repository. I'm talking about storing it in a place where somebody can go and view what's been done by others, whether they have access to Jupyter or not. And this could be decision makers or folks that don't use Jupyter on a regular basis just to see what was done. And then from an Explore standpoint, this also allows you to see what others have done in the past so that you can incorporate those type of analysis in what you're doing going forward. And this can be a real challenge, particularly as your organization gets larger, to even know what was done before. You could have one group over here that did work on something, and then you find out later after the fact that actually they had already figured all that stuff out and you wasted all this work during the process. So if you go look at the synthesize and action phase, then you kind of have a different scenario there. And this is where, if you're trying to share out results, this is a way that you can share results with others. They can comment back and you can collaborate together on things. And that way you can go through this process of iteration in your analysis that, most of us typically do when we're in an analytic exercise.
And to be fair, we're work in progress on this particular thing. But again, here, we need to figure out a way to make this possible, but in a regulated way. Some people don't need access to all these different data sets, and we're working through with our governance team on how to make this possible. But again, it makes the analyst job much easier because they can say, oh, all these analyses have already been done, but we're still protecting ourselves and we're protecting our customers by making sure that only the right people can see the right data sets and output.
All right, so another piece of this is the explore and analyze phase, and I already talked about metadata a little bit earlier, but this screenshot is actually from Tableau, and if you're familiar with Tableau, then there's a feature in Tableau where you can hover over a field that you're going to be using in Tableau, and it basically shows the metadata under the field. The problem is, of course, in Tableau, you have to actually enter that information in the Tableau, but wouldn't it be interesting if in Jupyter you could actually see this? So you're going to go back to the idea of some type of data source browser where you can see what data is out there, what columns are out there. You could actually hover over this information and see the metadata underneath. And that way you don't have the context switch between what you have in front of you and something that's online that tells you the data dictionary that has all the information in it, or your company's metadata catalog or something along those lines. And the less that you have the context switch, the more you can be productive and you can find the things that you need more easily. A second thing is code completion and contextual data. So, when you think about, modern IDEs that are out there, and Jupyter does have facilities for code completion involved, then why not have your code completion integrated with your metadata data catalog so that as you're typing a field, it can actually pop up and tell you what's actually there. And on top of it, going back to what Rod was talking about earlier with actually logging what your users are doing on a regular basis, why not have contextual data there too? So in other words, you have a group that's using this data on a regular basis, prioritize it. Tell them this is the most important thing. This is the thing that most people are using and things like that to help them get to what they need a little bit more quickly. And then finally, you think about like the database schemas itself. So if you've got an RDBMS underneath and you're trying to work with that, maybe you can just put your database schema in there to give people an understanding of how everything kind of connects together.
One thing I'd say here is like Netflix has a huge presence here. The reason Netflix is very successful is because they are very good at analyzing their own, like how people are using their product, right? Very similarly, we can actually, like when you start doing things like this, you have a tremendous amount of information on how your customers are using data. We're actually wearing our other hat. We're actually also looking at this kind of information, how people are using through our notebook, how people are using all our different data sources to help us work out how to constantly evolve and improve our own data sources themselves, therefore improving the entire customer ecosystem.
And this last one, I'll just cut through really quick because I want to make sure we get to questions as well. I talked a little bit earlier about having a continuous integration and delivery pipeline, and mentioned NBDime earlier. I think one really good example of this is that from a regulatory standpoint, using NBDime, but then what you do is before you commit to GitHub and commit your notebook out there, that you actually remove all the data from the notebook as well. If you do that and you make sure that the data is not out there, you kind of address your data sharing concerns and needs as well, but then other folks can still use those notebooks for the purpose that they need to be using them for and rerun the things in a reproducible analysis. Here you'll see Airflow, and then if you hit the next one, Spotify's Luigi. These are really good ways for you to actually take notebooks and then be able to actually run those notebooks in such a way that you can connect things together in a data process. And in these tools, you can also build in things like regulatory checks and making sure that folks can do things certain ways, like use a batch ID versus use their personal ID. So if they're not there, then the rest of their team can do the work that they need to do as well. And so that's something to also consider.
Basically, it lets you schedule notebooks, but in a highly regulated way.
So tools are great, but they're only as good as your data governance policies. If you don't have really good data governance in place, then a lot of the things we talked about today you can't actually do. The second thing is to really ensure you embed this in your culture. Now, going back to the idea, make it something that's easy for everybody in your organization to do, and then they'll end up doing it because it's just easy to do it, and it benefits them as well.
And one thing I'll say here is, so here I'll plug a bit that I've been at Capital One a year. David's been here a lot longer. I've been incredibly impressed with one thing with Capital One, that our culture does make this embedding in our culture a little bit easier. But what we're finding is something really amazing, and I think it's somewhat unique to Capital One, but may not necessarily be unique to Capital One. As we've gotten these tools out, we're actually finding little micro teams like organically forming. They're helping each other work out how to do this analysis. They're helping each other work out how to use these tools. It's actually becoming a big part of what they do. Now, part of this is we go through reasonably frequent, like every couple of weeks, some kind of training, some kind of session, someone come up and give a demo as to what you did, best case scenario, that kind of thing. But you're finding these small groups connect, like organically form, and actually use these tools more and more, which is an incredibly exciting thing about embedding it in your culture.
Okay, and then workarounds are a red flag. If you start seeing those type of things, like you put a process in place and people start working around what you put in place, then you need to really take a step back and say, what are we doing wrong in our process so that we can do it differently to ensure that everybody's following the rules, but doing it in the easiest way possible.
This particular one's my favorite, take a customer-centric approach. Like the way we did this was we started pretty much, and we said, let's just have a big analysis, like talk to all the people who actually will use this, or various kinds of analysis, various kinds of data scientists. Let's understand their use cases, let's understand how they're using these products. That way it makes our team a lot more focused as to what to provide. And then when we provide it, we don't just like go off in a corner and go cave and go build something and come out within 6 months. We actively used a lot, like we asked for help from some of the analyst leaders and said, go find 2 or 3 people to help us actually make sure that we're building the right thing. We rotate those people, get your customers deeply involved in your process, make it such that it's not a us versus you or you versus them kind of thing. Make them part of the process and make them collaborators in building the tools that you want to build.
And then the last thing is nothing is new. Everybody's done something like this before. So it's amazing. I used NBDime as an example before. We felt like we needed to build something like that, and we went out there and guess what? There was something already out there. So don't, as an organization, it's just not necessary to go and reinvent the wheel all the time. Sometimes it may feel like the cool thing to do as an engineer, and I'm an engineer myself, so I like doing the cool thing. But at the same time, you can add so much more value if you can get things out there quickly, and then focus on the things where there really is a significant gap, and that's really unique to your organization.
All right. Thank you.
Do we have time for questions?
5 minutes. Yeah.
5 minutes. All right. Great.
Thank you. Great discussion. You made a big point of talking about deeply involving the extended team and fostering collaboration. How far does that go with Jupyter, and are there other tools or platforms you use to extend the collaboration to developers that are operationalizing models, to IT, to the governance team, to the business?
So I want to unpackage your question into 2 things. One is you first asked how deeply do you involve your customers and stuff. I'll say that there's involve them as much time as they can give you, right? Make them part of the process, and that's for everything that to answer the second part of your question, the list of things that we're actually doing, for everything we build, we involve our customers very deeply. And so we try to make sure that everything we're building definitely has to have at least a set of customers that have said, yes, this is valuable through some kind of POC, some kind of, even a paper demo. It's very critical to us that we always do this before we build any code gets committed to Git.
Is there something technologically unifying? Is Jupyter extend to these other constituents in the total workflow?
Yeah, so I think,
and if not, are there other things that you also use?
so I think there is a couple of things. I mean, we heavily use GitHub issues to track what feedback our customers have, and Slack. In terms of Jupyter itself and what we do around Jupyter, what we find is that it's not just good for a business analyst or data scientist, but even folks like data engineers and things like that can use it as well. And so we find a lot of people kind of test things out and use Jupyter as a testing ground to figure out how to do things. And oftentimes, we'll actually have people come back to us and have like a pull request back to us and say, hey, can you add this thing in? Love to see this library in it and stuff as well. And so we have a very open ecosystem from that standpoint. We do have other tools as well. Unfortunately, I can't talk about specifics on those, but we have other tools that are part of that ecosystem that kind of connect everything together as well. So.
Thanks. This was very good presentation. You saw me nodding pretty much at every bullet because at PayPal we have the same kind of problems and challenges. My question was on the metadata and reuse. How much of that has been built out, and how much of it do you use Jupyter for?
So I don't know. A fair amount of the data gathering has been built out. The Jupyter part of it is right now in, I would say, alpha, not yet in beta.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, as an organization, then the important step that we've taken is ensure that there is a central metadata catalog. And so I think that's absolutely a first step to get things done. And then from there, then you can leverage that in all these other tools like Jupyter. So the browser that Raj mentioned earlier, we would not be able to build that unless we had something like the metadata catalog in place.
We have time for one more quick question.
Hi, I was wondering if you could reiterate the use of the DAG, the directed acyclic graph, produced by Airflow in your data management process?
Let me think about how I can best talk about that. Yes, we are very regulated, and that includes talking about some of these things as well. So I think in the case of Airflow, then the value in that is that there's quite a bit of flexibility in Airflow. If we were to use Airflow, for you to be able to use things for individual users, as well as provide capabilities for production processes as well. And Airflow has capabilities to really cover both needs. So, for example, from Jupyter, you may integrate Jupyter with Airflow, and then execute scheduled notebooks on Airflow as a result. I'd say it's always valuable as well to ensure that there's an understanding of what's happening under the covers. So it's good to also bubble up what that DAG or directed acyclic graph looks like in the actual IDE or tool that your users are actually using, so they can understand what's actually happening behind the scenes. Just as a regulated company, internally transparency is very, very important. Not just to folks the folks that directly use the tool, but the folks that do not indirectly use the tool as well. Hope that answered your question.
Great. Let's thank our speakers one more time.